Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. I am Kevin Grasso, your host for this episode, and I'm excited to talk with Paul Kroeger today about word order. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, a little bit about Paul. He teaches syntax and semantics at Dallas International University and is a senior linguistics consultant for SIL International. He holds a PhD in linguistics from Stanford University. His academic interests include descriptive syntax and semantics, Malayo-Polynesian languages, especially languages of Borneo, and linguistic issues in translation. In addition to a book on Tagalog syntax, he is the author of 3 textbooks, Analyzing Grammar, Analyzing Syntax, both published by Cambridge University Press, and most recently, Analyzing Meaning, An Introduction to Semantics and Pragmatics, published in open access format by Language Science Press. And these are actually all books that we have recommended before on this podcast for people who are interested in introductions to these topics. And the reason why one of the reasons why we always recommend these is because Paul was my teacher. So he's been very influential to me in introducing me to the world of formal syntax and semantics. So I'm very excited personally to have him on the show.
Well, you also introduced me to the world of Hebrew, so I appreciate that.
No worries. Great. So let's for this first part, we're just going to talk about some basic terms and syntactic principles. So the idea is that we want to lay a foundation for how linguists talk about word order and what that means and why it matters. So to begin with, let's just start out. What does it mean for a language to have a certain basic word order?
There's actually 2 ways to think about that. From a linguistic analysis point of view, you could ask, what's the underlying word order? The abstract, what we used to call the deep structure, the underlying syntactic structure of the sentence. That's one way you could think about basic order. The other way to think about what's just the normal sentence? What's the normal way people are going to say this most of the time, what they actually say, the surface structure. And for a language like English, those two come out to be pretty close to each other. But other languages, say a language like German, they're not really the same. In a German main clause, if there's no auxiliary, the verb is going to show up in second position. But most people to analyze the underlying representation of the abstract structure would start with the verb at the end of the sentence. And I think some of the debates about, say, Hebrew word order may be related to this. I think if I remember right, Homestead, it's been a long time since I looked at Homestead, but I think his views on word order, he tends to start more with this analytical idea of this underlying representation as his basic order, where other people are going for just the normal basic way to say things. So anyway, that's one issue. So I think for most people, the surface word order, the thing that we actually say most of the time, would be the place to start. But that turns out to be a tricky concept. How do you get at what that is?
Well, I mean, the whole, obviously, what is a normal sentence, right?
Exactly, yes.
I mean, that's part of the issue.
So when people are thinking about normally we start with statements rather than questions or commands because we know they're special. We'll start with a positive statement because negation is something extra, something that's special. Normally we start with an active voice sentence because passive is special in some way. Pronouns have special properties. Pronouns sometimes tend to move more toward the beginning of the sentence as opposed to a regular noun phrase with the same function. So if you're looking for the basic word order, it's a good idea to look primarily at full noun phrases rather than pronouns. In some languages, the word order inside a subordinate clause would be more rigidly determined or constrained than the word order in a main clause. And some people have taken this as a reason to look first at subordinate clauses. If there's a difference, that maybe a subordinate clause is something closer to the basic. Children seem to acquire the more basic form earlier in general, and I think that applies to word order as well. So acquisition can help us. But the big thing, if we're talking about basic order, well, which one gets used the most, right? Sheer frequency. There's some tricky things about measuring frequency as well, but that's one thing. And then the second thing would be distribution. In other words, what kinds of environments can this kind of sentence be used in? Word orders, special word orders often have special functions. And so the technical term for this is markedness. A highly marked or special word order may only be acceptable in certain very special kinds of contexts, when we're doing, calling attention to a certain argument or something like that. Whereas the unmarked or the vanilla, the normal basic word order, is going to be compatible with a lot of different environments. It'll have the most general possible range of uses.
Yeah, I think that is a really helpful way to think about it, is this, markedness and, whether it's used in special contexts or not. And of course, again, the next question is, what does a special context mean, right? And what is normal, right? All these things. But I do think we have, actually fairly solid intuitions, about a lot of these things on like what can be used in certain, and of course you can't like rely wholly on intuitions. But the idea that, we know there are some certain kinds of verbs or structures that are used in certain places and not in other places. So I think that's key. So do you have anything else on this topic, just on like introducing basic order before we move to like what is a grammatical category?
Well, as you said, native speakers do have fairly clear intuitions about when a certain sentence is appropriate in a certain context or for a certain purpose. And the challenge with ancient languages is we don't have very many native speakers around. We can't ask for their intuitions.
Right.
So we're always struggling. But so again, these things we were saying about the basic word order being used in the most different contexts, the term would be pragmatically neutral. Pragmatics has to do with how the language is used for special functions, and including how do we package the information. So the most basic order would be neutral in the sense that there's no special marking of one argument or one phrase over another in terms of their discourse functions.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really important point that we won't get into too much right now, but just that meaning is affecting order.
Exactly.
or reflecting, depending on how you want to, parse out the chicken and the egg question here. But the idea is that syntax and semantics and pragmatics are all interwoven together. And so you really, if we want to say something like, the basic order is the pragmatically neutral order, then what we have to say is, what does it mean to be pragmatically neutral? What does it mean to be pragmatically marked? And those are, issues fundamentally of meaning. And I think that's part of the issue within studies on Greek and Hebrew, is a lot of times people will do, syntax, right? But you really can't do syntax without doing pragmatics or semantics, right? And vice versa, right? You really should be doing all of them together. And of course, everyone can't be an expert in everything. But you have to know at least the basics of pragmatics and semantics to really do, good syntax. So when we talk about word order, right, what we're talking about most of the time is the order of subject, verb, and object, right? So how are those three things related? So I said subject, verb, object in English. That's the normal analysis of what's basic. Subject first, then the verb, then the object. So to begin with, then we really have to define what a grammatical category is, or specifically what a verb is, right? Because that is the category that's everything is revolving around. There's the object, right? That's the object of the verb, and the subject of the verb, right? But they all relate to this thing called a verb. So can you give us a definition or describe for us what a verb actually is?
When we're talking about grammatical categories, we're talking about parts of speech, right? So what we learn in school about the parts of speech is description or definition in terms of semantic type. A noun names a person, place, or thing. A verb is a word that describes an action. An adjective describes a state. Those definitions actually don't work very well. If you think about the noun fool and the adjective foolish, they mean the same thing. They're making the same kind of claim about whatever person we're describing. And there's many, many similar examples. So when we define the parts of speech, the categories, we're talking about word categories, we have to define them in terms of grammatical properties. So a grammatical category, a lexical category, lexical meaning a category of words, would be a class of words that shares certain grammatical properties. So I said foolish is an adjective partly because that suffix ish, that shows up on adjectives. Fool is a noun partly because it can take the S for plural, fool, fools. So those are morphological properties, the kinds of prefixes and suffixes that can be attached to different kinds of words. We also look at grammatical properties about where they can occur. So adjectives can occur as modifiers to a noun within a noun phrase, noun, etc. So the main point is these categories are defined in terms of grammatical properties that they share. We give them the name based on their prototype semantic class. So verbs, the verb is the class of words that share certain grammatical properties, but on the whole, if you have basic terminology that refers to actions like hit and jump and kick, we're going to call that verb because of the semantics, but that's not how we identify which word belongs to which class. And not only words have categories, but phrases as well. So I guess we'll talk about those in a minute. But one reason the categories are important is because when we're describing word order patterns, that's the way we generalize over the patterns of the language. We talk about the noun coming after the definite article and the verb coming before its noun phrase object and stuff. We can't spell out the specific order for every specific sentence using particular words. We need to talk in categories of words, and that's what these, in other words, defining the general patterns of word order, we need to refer to category, not word by word, individual words.
Right. So I think that actually leads to the next question of what is a phrase? So you've mentioned this a couple of times, like what is a noun phrase? How would a verb phrase, for example, be different than a verb?
When you did ask me about a verb, let me just go ahead and answer that question first. You said, what is a verb? Very good question.
Right.
A verb is a kind of a word. So it's a category of words, a lexical category. And in English, we can define its grammatical properties. It can be inflected for past tense, like run, ran, or heat, heated, or something. So it can be inflected for aspect, sing, singing, I have sung, take, took, token, take, took, token, taken. I'm getting myself. All right, so these kinds of tense and aspect morphological marking are special to verbs. Verbs can take a subject agreement marker in third person singular present tense. He eats, I eat, he eats, I sing, he sings. Other kinds of words in English don't do that. Verbs can be modified by adverbs, but not by adjectives, which is what one thing distinguishes them from nouns. Verbs function as the head of the clause, and that's why, as you say, that's the crucial thing we need to start. We'll talk about that in a minute. Another special thing about verbs is that they can take bare noun phrases as their direct object, where nouns and adjectives can sometimes take a prepositional phrase as an important part of its phrase, but they don't take bare noun phrase. They don't take a noun phrase object. Only verbs can take a noun phrase object. All right, so there again, I've mentioned phrase. Let me talk about phrases a little bit.
So hold on one second. Let me just interject a clarifying point here. So then what you're saying is that our semantic definition, just to reiterate this, that we learn a verb as an action, right, is really the problem is it doesn't describe all of the possible kinds of verbs, right? And so there are lots of verbs that aren't actions, for example.
Right.
There are states that are verbs and all kinds of other things. So, but the point then would be that if you look at the syntactic distribution and how it relates, for example, to a subject or, the inflectional morphology it takes. So like whether it can be inflected for, a certain tense and aspect markers, that is really what's determining whether it's a verb or not, right?
We use the semantic definitions as a way of naming the classes, naming the categories. But in terms of defining or determining what the membership is of the category, which category a particular word belongs to, we need to look at grammatical properties. The list I just gave you was a list for English verbs. Different languages will have different properties. And some, things like being inflected for tense and aspect, those typically belong to verbs, but there will be differences across languages, but it's got to be shared grammatical properties that determine the membership of the category.
Yeah, that's helpful. So now to a phrase, what exactly is a phrase?
A phrase is a group of words. And first of all, it's a group of words that functions as a unit for the purposes of word order. So where you have variation in word order, units of the sentence are being moved around, and the phrase is a unit of words that stick together. The technical name for that is a constituent. So a phrase is a constituent, a group of words that functions as a unit for purposes of word order. It's a special kind of constituent. It's big enough or grammatically complete. And the rules of the grammar of the language will decide what has to be in a noun phrase or an adjective phrase or a verb phrase to make it complete in that sense. But because it's complete, it can have its own independent grammatical function. So a complete noun phrase can be the subject of a clause or the object of a clause. A piece of a noun phrase can't. And finally, it's coherent. In other words, the things that are part of this unit have to be grammatically licensed by the rules that determine what kinds of phrases, what belongs in each kind of phrase. But the main thing is a complete constituent of a certain type, big enough to have an independent grammatical function.
So can you give an example of like a complete noun phrase versus an incomplete noun phrase?
The big dog who bit me is a complete noun phrase. Big dog is not by itself a complete noun phrase. So the big dog that bit me could be the subject of a sentence or the object of a sentence. I kicked the big dog that bit me. But I kicked big dog, that sounds like it's a proper name, some guy who's called big dog or something. It's just not a normal noun phrase. I'm not sure if that helps, but big dog by itself is a constituent, it seems. There are some grammatical tests we can apply to show that those two words do form a constituent, but not a complete constituent. It's not a big enough constituent to be the object or subject of a sentence.
Right. So the problem in English here, right, is that we don't like bare singular nouns like that. Like, I kicked big dog. We just doesn't work very well.
Bare singular nouns.
We like them sometimes.
It's a name, very special uses. Maybe the name of a species or something like man. Or we don't do it with octopus. Anyway, you're right. Those are restricted, and especially the combination though of adjective plus noun, modifier plus noun, without a determiner. In English, most of our noun phrases, unless they're plural, bare plurals work better. But you're right, bare singulars, especially with that modifier, those just don't work at all as phrases.
Right. So I kicked big dog is bad, but I kicked big dogs is okay. Or I kicked the big dog, or I kicked a big dog. All of those are fine. So it's just this one, big dog, right, that we just, for whatever reason, don't like.
And yet big dog has certain properties to show it is a unit in terms of word order. Those two things stick together. We can replace those two things together with a pronoun or a certain kind of pronoun. So they have the properties of a constituent, but not a phrase. They're not a complete phrase.
So so you've talked about a phrase and what a phrase is. So let's talk specifically about a verb phrase. And there are certain kinds, certain parts of a verb phrase that people talk about within syntax. Well, I mean, really all kinds of phrases. People have the term head, complement, and specifier. Can you spell out for us how these parts relate to a phrase?
Yes. The head of the phrase is the most important word, you might say. So in the phrase I was just talking about, the big dog who bit me, the big dog that bit me, the head of that phrase is the dog. And one thing the head does is it provides the semantic core. So we know the phrase, the big dog that bit me, is referring to a dog. That's the basic thing we're talking about. The head of the phrase determines the category of the phrase. So because the head is a noun, the phrase as a whole is a noun phrase. A verb phrase will have a verb as its head. An adjective phrase will have an adjective as its head. So the head determines the category of the phrase. It provides the semantic core of the phrase. The head selects some of the other constituents within that same phrase, and those would be called complements. A complement is a constituent, and notice that's complement with an E. complement, not with an I. So we're not saying nice things about the head, or the head is not saying nice things about the phrases. It's completing. It's take an example like there was the at the end of John 21, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. Just take the phrase, the rumor that this disciple would not die. The rumor is the head of that phrase. So we're talking about it's a noun phrase. But the complement clause, that his disciple would not die, only works with certain kinds of head nouns. The rumor that he would not die, the report that he would not die, the theory that he would not die, that's fine. But other kinds of nouns just don't work with that kind of complement. The pineapple that he would not die, the tree that he would not die, the table, So complements are selected by the head, meaning that certain heads require or allow certain complements and other heads don't take those same complements. That's the crucial thing about the complement. Then, say if we think of a noun phrase, there's other things we could add. The big dog that bit me. The big dog is a modifier. That's not selected by the head. Modifiers are not selected. They're added freely when it makes sense, when it fits the speaker's purposes in terms of getting the right meaning. So we call those adjuncts because they're adjoined. They're not selected. They're just stuck on there when it seems appropriate. And the same way the relative clause, the big dog that bit me, relative clauses are not selected by the head. They're, again, a kind of a modifier. So they're another kind of adjunct. And one important difference between the complements and the adjuncts is you can have many adjuncts. Potentially, the grammar doesn't impose a limit as to how many adjuncts you could have in the same phrase. There's psychological limitations, memory and processing issues that limit how much you're going to put in one phrase, but the grammar itself allows you an arbitrary number, unlimited number of adjuncts. Complements are very strictly limited. Each head determines how many. It could be one or two. There's usually a very small number.
Just to interject really quick about this difference between complement and adjunct. So with the examples we had, right? The dog that bit me. So that bit me there is an adjunct. And then the rumor that he would die there is actually a complement.
Yes.
But on the surface, they look the same in the sense that we're starting, this subordinate clause with that, right? And then we just, have extra information after. So the what you're saying is the way to tell the difference is the lexical item itself, right? Rumor requires a certain thing, the rumor itself, right? So that because of the semantics of the noun rumor, it specifies that there is a complement. But dog, for example, does not. So that's why, your examples of like the pineapple, that would die, or I can't remember exactly what you said.
The disciple would not die, right?
Right. That the disciple would not die, doesn't work, right? So the issue then is these nouns have different, semantic properties that are determining whether or not they have a complement. Is that fair to say? And of course they can all have adjuncts, right? But the thing after it might be a complement, might be an adjunct. It might look the same, and that would depend on the noun itself.
Yes, and one reason they look the same in English is because that has multiple functions. In the big dog that bit me, that is what we call a relativizer. It's introducing a relative clause, which is a kind of modifier. The rumor that this disciple would not die, that use of that is a complementizer. It's introducing a complement clause. And of course, we have the demonstrative that, not this one, but that one. In other languages, especially the relativizer and complementizer might have different forms. So we wouldn't have the same kind of ambiguity necessarily in other languages, although some languages probably do. And I think you're right. Complements are related to the meaning. They're selected grammatically. If we think about verbs, some verbs need an object. Those are transitive verbs. So the object would be the complement of the verb. Some verbs don't want an object. And some verbs can optionally take an object or not. They can be used either as intransitives or as transitives. And that's generally related to the meaning of the verb. It's at least partly determined by the semantics of the verb, or the semantics of the head, whatever kind of phrase we're talking about.
Great. So then this last term I mentioned was specifier. Can you help us understand what a specifier is?
That's harder in terms of traditional or descriptive grammar. I think traditionally the idea of specifier, mostly people thought about, say, the definite article, the, or words like that and this in English that introduced a noun phrase. But in modern formal syntax, most people don't want to treat that as a specifier anymore. But generally, people think of the subject of the sentence, for many languages anyway. For most languages, it probably works to think of the subject of the sentence as being the specifier of that sentence. And a sentence we need to talk about in a while here, but that's a kind of a phrase as well. So what they have in common, then, the specifier is going to be a unique element within the phrase. We said that you can have these modifiers, adjuncts, you can have many of them. Complements, potentially more than one. But the specifier is going to be unique, and it's usually going to occur at the edge of the phrase. In English, specifiers usually come first. In terms of complements, they're usually very close to the verb. Adjuncts could be farther from the verb, but the specifier is going to be at the very edge of the phrase, either beginning or the end, the outside edge of the phrase. I'm not sure I can say much more about specifiers at this point that'll be any useful to people. Yeah.
So then I think the important point here, right, is the identification with the subject in a lot of languages.
Yes, right.
So can you describe just in more detail, like what is a subject? And I know obviously, so just to back up here, all of these terms are there are books written on what these things are, right? Literally just trying to describe them. I mean, I think of Baker's Lexical Categories book. He's just trying to describe what a noun, verb, and adjective is, and it seems very mundane because we learn all this in school, but it's actually very complex when you start to think about all the world's languages and how these things interact with each other, and coming up with a theory that really captures the data is not simple. So that's just a caveat in general for these things. But so what is a subject? Because we have to figure that out in order to determine, even the order, right? Subject, verb, object. We need to know what the subject is.
Yeah, and you're right. None of these questions are simple. These are all very difficult questions. And the question of what a subject is, or even whether languages have subjects, is very controversial. But I'll tell you what I think. First of all, a subject is a core argument. And what a core argument means is it's an argument that's marked based on its grammatical relation rather than its semantic function. If you say, I hit the dog with a stick, the preposition with tells me the semantic function of the stick. It's an instrument. Some other languages would have an instrumental case marker, but there's a special either case or prepositional marker that indicates the semantic role of that argument. For subjects and objects, we have cases like nominative and accusative that don't tell us anything about the semantic function of the argument, but only its grammatical function. So that's what I mean by core argument. There's special status in the syntax. The subject is the most prominent core argument in terms of how the syntax works. And this will be, to a certain extent, different in different languages, but many languages will have constructions where, say, in a complex sentence where you have a main clause and a subordinate clause, those two clauses might share an argument in some way. And often the subject has a special role, a special status in those kinds of structures. They're the most likely, the most eligible to be shared in certain ways, or in some languages, they're the most eligible to be relativized if you're forming relative clauses. Often, if a language only agrees with one argument, it'll be the subject. So the subject is, the core argument is the most prominent, the most syntactically active core argument. And in most languages, the subject tends to be the default or unmarked choice of topic. We haven't gotten into topic and focus, but topic is often defined as what we're talking about. So most languages, most of the time, there'll be a correlation between grammatical subject and the discourse function of the topic. The default, the unmarked correlation. Not that they can't do something different, but statistically that happens a lot of the time. And that obviously is going to be significant for word order issues.
Right. So that's helpful. And I think one of the other, terms, obviously that's defined with subject often, is predicate. So maybe we can say something about the difference between subject and predicate and what exactly a predicate is.
Well, the predicate for a clause most of the time would be the verb. Right? So we talked about verbs as the head of, we can think of the verb as the head of the clause. A clause, we should say, is a simple sentence. And a simple sentence will make some claim about the world or describe some situation. It'll either be an event that took place, an action that someone did, a relation that's, so like John kicked the dog, John loves the dog, John owns a dog, or John is happy. It could be just a state. The predicate is the word that determines what kind of situation or event or action is being described. So again, the predicate provides the semantic core for the clause as a whole, and it also selects the other elements that have to be part of that clause, the arguments of the clause. So for a predicate like love, you need to have a person who has, some kind of being that's sentient, that has emotional states. Obviously, it has to be animate, but it has to be the right kind of argument in order to feel love, right? So that's an example of how the predicate, in this case, the verb love, is the predicate of that clause. John loves the dog. Only a certain kind of noun phrase will work as the subject of that predicate because it's part of the selection. The verb selects, the verb love selects a subject of a certain type. So the predicate defines what kind of situation we're describing and what kinds of participants have to be involved in that situation. The experiencer is the lover, the stimulus, sometimes we call as the object of his affection. If John kicks the dog, we have John as the agent doing the action and the dog is the patient, the receiver of the action. And those semantic functions are determined by the predicate itself. Predicates are more general term. They don't have to be verbs. So if I say John is happy or John is fond of the dog, those are adjectives that still take arguments.
Yeah. So I think then, just relating subject and predicate, the predicate then is saying something about the subject in general. And I think this is why the subject is normally a topic, right? Would you agree with that?
Well, it depends what day you ask. Yeah. This is an important question, and it's not an easy question. When the predicate, so first of all, let me say about English, the fact of English grammar is that every clause has to have a verb. And so we get the idea that the verb is the predicate, but if I say John is happy, happy is the real predicate there. Because happy takes just a single argument that has to be animate, has to have emotional states. John is fond of the dog. Fond is also an adjective, but this is an adjective that takes two arguments. The is there is purely a grammatical device to let this adjective function as a predicate in the clause. Civilized language, I shouldn't say that, but many other languages don't require the verb to be, this copular verb. And so there it's more obvious that a verb is one kind of predicate, but adjectives and nouns can also be predicates or noun phrases, etc. Okay, so when we predicate something of a certain argument, John is happy, I have asserted that a certain state holds, that John is in a certain emotional state. And you'll judge that statement to be true if it turns out that is, in fact, his emotional state. Am I talking about John? Well, in that case, there's only one argument there. There's nothing else to be talked about. But John is fond of the dog. All right, John is the subject. It will be true if John's emotional state toward the dog is what I've described. But am I talking about John? Well, again, because in most languages, the subject is the default topic, without more context, we're going to assume that. But there are clearly contexts where that doesn't hold. So just because you have a simple subject-object-verb type word order doesn't necessarily mean the subject has to be the topic. In other words, what we're talking about. That's why I was hedging a little bit on.
Right. So identification of the subject with what we are talking about is going to vary depending on the context. But the idea that the predicate describes the subject in some way, right? I think that would have to hold, right? Just because it's in the definition of predicate to predicate, some property of a subject, right?
Well, it's a very tricky thing. If I say John kicked the dog, I have predicated a property of John. Namely, he has the property of having kicked the dog. I've also predicated something of the dog. The dog has the property of having been kicked by John. So we can think of the predicates, we can compose them in either order if you think about which, and really we're making predications about both of them. And one reason this gets to be tricky and an important issue is some people have tried to define topic in terms of predication. And I think this leads to a lot of confusion. I personally disapprove of this practice, but the people who do it are smarter than me. So I'm not going to criticize. I'm just saying I don't think it's a great idea. But so I'd like to stick, when we're talking about something, I'm going to call that the topic. Predication is what we do to a subject and an object, all the arguments of the predicate, really, that we're predicating of those arguments.
Right. I mean, another definition of the more formal one of predicate is just, something that's like unsaturated, right? That's incomplete and that needs to be completed with something else. So run, something needs to run, right? And so in this sense, the subject is often, the thing that, in the case of run, it is the thing that is saturating that, right? But there are other, verbs like give, right, that require more things that need to saturate it, right? More arguments is another way to say it.
Yeah, exactly. And when you use the word saturate, there's a technical sense, a technical use of the term saturate. We're talking again about completeness. What is saturation? Well, it's a complete proposition. When we combine a predicate with the right number of arguments, the number of arguments that it selects, we will have a complete proposition. It's a claim about the world which could be judged as being true or false in a particular context. That's completeness. That's a saturated, in other words, not lacking any of the arguments of the predicate.
Right. And that leads us to the other, kind of argument, is an object. So, do you have any quick thoughts on what an object is versus a subject, for example?
Yeah, when talking about subjects, I said it's a core argument, and an object is the other kind of core argument. Again, it's an argument which is marked for case or agreement based on its grammatical relation rather than a semantic function. Now, of course, there are arguments which are neither subjects nor objects. The ones who are marked for semantic functions, like with prepositions or with some kind of special semantic case marking, those we call oblique arguments. So an object is not the subject, but it's also not an oblique argument. It's a core argument which is not the subject. And that's maybe all we need to say. I don't know.
Yeah. And just to point out, I mean, one of the things you said was that it doesn't have a particular semantic function. And I think that's an important point because a lot of times people will try to define, okay, so like accusative case, what is its meaning, right? And that's not really the best way to think about it. It is a syntactic marker, right, that marks something, and the meaning of the noun will depend on the meaning of the verb, right? And I think actually Beth Levine has a really good article called Objecthood came out in 1999, and we can post a link to this in the description. But where she just goes through, all the different semantic roles, for example, that especially an object in English can have, and it's quite bewildering if you go through the data, and Levine definitely goes through. She is a data person, so she goes through all of the options. But different languages are going to do this in different ways. So a classic example is verbs of touching sometimes are oblique arguments in some languages, and other times they're marked with accusative case. But the idea is that in any given language, the object is going to have this syntactic definition. So that's and I think the other point with this, right, is that it's the complement of the verb, right?
Yes.
To go back to that structural
Right.
Definition. So if a verb has if the verb is the head of a phrase, then the complement is the object and the specifier is the subject. Is the basic way that we've talked about it so far. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's good. And one of the classic ways to identify the object, at least the direct object, the primary object, would be that if you change an active voice sentence, like John kicked the dog, into a passive sentence, like the dog was kicked by John, the thing that becomes the subject of the passive sentence was the object of the active sentence. So passivization gives us a way to test for identify the primary object. Primary because some verbs can take two objects. I gave Mary a book. Mary and a book are both bare noun phrases in English. They're both treated like objects, but one of them is the primary object. One of them has special status. Neither one of those is oblique arguments. They're both core arguments, but we have to distinguish. When you have the verb has two objects, we need to distinguish primary from secondary, something along those lines.
Right. And of course, like we said, we could get into a lot more detail on all of these things. But so before we start talking specifically about word order, I want to talk about one more thing that I think will just set up our conversation. So we've talked about pragmatics a little bit and pragmatic neutral sentences. And so one of the things that people talk about is a functional projection, right? And so this is like, again, well, let me just ask you, what is a functional projection? Help us out, and then we'll talk about how that relates to subject, verb, and object.
Yes, good. First of all, the term projection. We've said that the head of the phrase determines the category of the phrase. Noun phrase has a noun as its head. The verb phrase has a verb as its head. The adjective phrase has a head that's an adjective. One way to say that, the technical way to describe that, is that the phrase is a projection of the head. The noun phrase is a projection of the noun. Those are lexical categories, meaning the nouns and verbs and adjectives are normal words. They have lexical semantic content. They're regular words, they're content words. A functional projection would be a phrase whose head is not a regular content word. It's purely a grammatical morpheme. Maybe like an auxiliary verb or something else, but it's not a normal content word like a noun, verb, adjective. I think that's the simplest way to think of it. Now that seems pretty general, but in practice, the most important of these functional projections are going to be phrases which turn out to be sentences or like clauses. So the main clause, now here, we're getting into very technical issues, and there are different theories are going to talk about this in different ways. But I would refer to the main clause as being an inflectional phrase, where the inflection on the verb, say the tense, maybe tense aspect agreement, depending what you want to put in there, but the some inflectional features on the verb will count somehow as the head of that sentence. That would be your main clause. Subordinate clauses are often, as we mentioned just now, introduced by a word like that, or an indirect statement with that, indirect questions with whether. Those are called complementizers. They introduce complement clauses. And those complementizers themselves can be viewed as the head of the complement clause. For interesting reasons, we can talk about why they should be the head, but maybe we won't have time for that. But those two, the inflectional phrase and the complementizer phrase, are examples of functional projections that are really important in word order studies, because they give you their specifier positions, give you a place where many languages use those positions for special discourse functions. Special new information or changing topic if you want to talk about a different topic instead of the one you've been talking about. Those specifier positions are of the functional categories turn out to be very important for word order variation studies.
Right. And so I think this is the point that we need to get across here, is that the word order might be affected by things outside of just the subject and verb, right? So if we talk about a verb, right, that's inflected for tense, right? The idea is that some languages are going to make the subject, move to a certain place, and other languages, so, I mean, I had a syntax class at Hebrew University, and the professor, who was just a brilliant guy, he would just the only thing he would say, like, every single class, so the subject is spec IP. It's the specifier of the inflectional phrase, right? That's the position of the subject, right? He would just hammer that every class. And so, but the idea here is that you might have other things that affect movement, right? People have put, things like topic and focus. People talk about that, topic and focus, as triggering movement, right? And that's how, we haven't defined those terms yet, but that's how information is conveyed, right, about certain constituents. And the idea that what some people have done is they said, okay, that's a projection at a certain place, and then a subject or an object might move there, for example, and then that affects the word order that we see on the surface. So I think the main point here is that these certain functional projections, there's all kinds of them, but they might affect what we see as the word order on the surface, but those might disqualify the sentence as what we've said it would be pragmatically neutral. Does that make sense?
Yeah, now we're getting into deep waters here. So,
right.
But there's no way to avoid it. If you're going to talk about word order in either Greek or Hebrew, there are deep questions. When we talk about movement, there's two, I think, aspects of it. Some theories assume that even to get to basic word order, a lot of movement is going on. Things are moving out of various positions and into different positions, and where they actually get pronounced, even in a basic sentence, is the result of some abstract movement. That's a theoretical question. We can set that aside. But the differences between basic word order, it's pragmatically neutral, that can be used in lots of different contexts, versus a special word order that only works in a certain context, often has to do with changing the topic. I'm going to talk about something else for a while, or putting special focus on some new crucial information. Focus, what we'll talk about, is one way to think about the focus is it's answering the current question under discussion. If here's the main point I want to tell you about, that focused information, for some purposes we might want to emphasize the focused information. One way of doing that is often to move it to a special position. And these special positions then, that are different from normal basic word order, often they involve one of these functional projections that we're talking about, a specifier of the inflectional phrase or the complementizer phrase. Those are, as you say, that those word orders then will be only appropriate where you have a special discourse function involved, if not for just the normal everyday kind of thing. Certainly if you have the wrong discourse function for the word order, that's going to create an unacceptable sentence.
Right. So can you just let's give a concrete example of like a question in English. Yeah, give us a question in English and tell us what's happening syntactically.
Because that's an interesting point. I said that when we look for basic word order, typically we start with statements rather than questions. One example is that in questions, the subject doesn't come first anymore in English. So instead of saying, you went to Wisconsin. You went to Wisconsin for spring break. Who goes to Wisconsin for spring break? Anyway, the statement would be subject followed by, you will go to Wisconsin. Let's make it future tense. You will go to Wisconsin for your spring break. Subject followed by auxiliary, then the main verb, etc. But if I ask a question, the auxiliary has to come first. Will you go to Wisconsin for your spring break? So that's an example of how questions can force non-basic word orders. In this case, the auxiliary verb seems to have to move before the subject. In older versions of English, older varieties of English, we could do that with main verbs. There's a verse in the New Testament, in the King James Version, where the Jesus is saying to his disciples, they're talking about, I think it's in Matthew, about the temple and the great stones and what a magnificent building it is. The King James Version has Jesus saying, "Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another. Seest thou the great buildings?" Seest is the main verb coming before the subject thou. Or a content question, a why question. Why seest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye? Question word first, because that's going to show up in one of these. It's a focus position, right? The specifier of a CP, a complementizer phrase. But then before the subject, you get the main verb itself. So those are contexts where the verb moves, apparently shows up before the subject. And the same thing would happen with negation in older English. In modern English, we put an auxiliary verb before negation. But in Patrick Henry gave his famous speech around 1774, 75, something like that. "I know not what course others may take." Instead of saying, "I do not know," he said, "I know not." The main verb shows up before negation. John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." I think when he gave it, it was 1961, he was probably using a formal literary style, because we don't do that. Do not ask is what we would say in modern English. But so these are examples of how verbs can move around for certain purely grammatical. I mean, these aren't directly related to discourse functions, but they're purely grammatical. In questions and negation, things move around a little bit. I'm not sure if that was what you were asking for, but those are some examples of verb movement.
Yeah, so the idea is that in English, we would normally have subject-verb order, right? You will go to Wisconsin for spring break. And then when we do introduce some sort of other meaningful element, right? In this case, the fact that it's a question, right? The word order changes, right? Will you go? And so the idea then would be what we need to do to figure out the word order, the basic word order of a certain language, would be to find those kinds of contexts where we don't have that meaning and see what's there, right? So maybe to begin with, we can talk about other things. So we've said questions, right? I mean, we've mentioned topic and focus a couple times. What other things do we need to be looking out for if we're going to say, okay, if we want to determine the basic word order in Greek or Hebrew, what might trigger movement that might disqualify this particular clause from being quote unquote basic or pragmatically neutral?
I would distinguish the situation just now talking about English questions and negation. That's a variation in word order that's not basic, but it's triggered purely grammatically, just by virtue of forming a question. It's grammatically encoded. It's got to be this way. The discourse functions are going to be more optional. It's not like it has to be this way, but it's a choice that speakers make in order to package the information in a way that's going to be easier for hearers to process. Right? We can give some examples of that. Well, there may be other grammatically determined features of word order. Well, like with German, I mentioned in a main clause in German, if there is no auxiliary verb in the main clause, then the verb will show up at second position. If there is no auxiliary, it's going to show up at the end of the sentence. Again, that's a purely grammatical fact about German. Let me give an example of one that's discourse related. I mentioned that subject in most languages is understood as being the default topic of the sentence, what we're talking about. And in some languages, that's grammaticalized to the point where the subject position is inherently going to be interpreted as a topic. I think spoken French is an example like this. A number of Bantu languages have this property. And what that means is that if you want to, suppose you want to answer a question, who gave you this book? I know in some of the southern Bantu, Sesotho, I think is the language I'm thinking about now, but some of the southern Bantu languages, because the subject position, the default normal subject position, which is before the verb, it's normal S subject verb object order, but that's default subject position is associated with topicality, with what we're talking about. If I ask you, who gave you that book? The giver of the book is the focus of my question, and that will be the focus of the answer. That's not who we're talking about, because I don't know who we're talking. I don't know who gave it to you. In order to talk about the person, I have to know who it is we're talking about. So that's the focus of the question, and the focus of the question can't be the person we're talking about. In answering the question, we could not say, John gave me the book. We could not put John in the normal subject position. We would have to either use a passive construction, the book was given by John, or use a special sentence construction that's called a cleft sentence. It was John who gave me this book. Some special word order device to get the subject, the focus of the answer, the person who gave the book, to get the focus of the answer out of the normal subject position, because that normal position is inherently interpreted as being a topic. And if it's the focus of the answer, can't be the topic.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry, you keep going if you have another example.
Well, I had one from Malay. Malay is interesting for a lot of reasons. In a Malay narrative, traditional Malay narrative, the main events in the narrative, the main events on the storyline, are typically expressed in passive voice. And that's unusual. And to some people that proves, well, that can't be a passive, can it? Because passive is supposed to be this secondary or background or, kind of a supporting information, not the main information. But that's how they do it in Malay. And by the syntactic definition of passive, we can show it really is a passive. So the passive voice is used for the main events, especially where you have a sequence of actions by the same actor. So the farmer went out to the field, hitched up his buffalo to the plow, plowed the furrow, flooded the rice, planted the rice, whatever he's doing. There's a sequence of actions that the farmer is doing, the same actor. And since we're talking about actions by the same actor, that actor is the one we're talking about. Topic continuity means that we're talking about the same topic from clause to clause. And that's typically how narratives work. You talk about one topic for a while, and then you'll switch and talk about someone else. So those events, those actions performed by that actor are expressed in the passive, but not with normal subject-verb-object order. The subject doesn't come first in those orders. The subject moves to the end of the sentence. The verb, passive verb, followed by the subject. So the buffalo was hitched up by the farmer, and the field was plowed by the farmer. And you don't have to keep saying the farmer because we know who we're talking about. They just have maybe a pronoun or maybe no pronoun at all. We know who we're talking about, so that person doesn't have to be mentioned. And what you get is just passive verb plus the subject, which is the thing that the agent is doing something to. So why is that? Because the buffalo was hitched by the farmer. The field was plowed by the farmer. The subject is the buffalo or the field, not the one doing the action. The doer of the action, the farmer, is not the subject, but he is the topic. So it's the mismatch there between subject and topic that means, okay, then again, in Malay, default subject position is inherently topical. And so a non-topic is not eligible to occupy that position. It's going to move to the end of the sentence.
Right. Yeah, that's another really interesting one, and something that I think it actually is quite relevant for, at least biblical Hebrew. Well, both, right? I mean, but especially biblical Hebrew, where you do have a certain kind of verb form that's used in narrative, right?
Right.
And so the issue being not necessarily that, right, we're not going to say all of these things are identical, right? In fact, they're very, very different. But the idea that narrative is not some special genre where we can say, oh, if it's default in narrative, then it's default in the language, right? And in fact, it could be the opposite, that if it's default in narrative, then that's marked in some way, and we should throw out those clauses as not pragmatically neutral, right? Because and this is something that's been discussed, and part of the problem is, especially when you're dealing with ancient languages, where you have a very limited set of data, right? We have a drop in the bucket of data for biblical Hebrew than really what we should have for linguistic analysis, right? but the idea that with regard to frequency, we can say, okay, certain clauses are verb subject because they have this particular verb form that's predominantly used in narrative. But the question then is that a pragmatically neutral example, right? Those and again, it's similar to German, right? Where when you have the presence of the auxiliary, it's actually more similar to German, I think, than Malay, in the sense that like it seems to be more grammatical, right? When you have a certain verb form, you always have this order, and it's really not pragmatic in the sense that there's something that's triggering this, but it is like this verb form occupies a certain place in the syntax, and that requires a certain order. So do you have anything to say on that before we wrap up? I'd just like to go over a couple last questions.
Yes, the point you made about the narrative is special. That's a really important point. And when you're working on an ancient language, all we have to work with is texts. So we analyze text, and we tend to think that the text is, that's all we have to work with. But for a lot of purposes, most people take conversation as being the most basic use of language. So a conversational usage is what probably we should be aiming for in terms of understanding what's the most basic word order or other features. And you mentioned this issue in Hebrew narrative, that you have a certain verb form. Is it the vayikto, as I remember from your thesis? If that's the normal way of expressing a mainline event in the narrative, you can have a lot of them in narrative, and grammatically that one simply has to occur at the beginning of the clause. If that's the sample that you take to do your frequency counts, then your frequency is going to be skewed by this grammatical requirement that the verb in a certain verb form, which is the most common one, an important one in narrative, is going to be very high frequency. That's what frequency is important, but really there's a lot of issues like that make it difficult, and especially where you have a limited corpus in ancient language, you can't check with native speakers. It's tough. Frequency is probably not the most reliable basis for judging what's basic, what's unmarked.
Yeah, that's good. And one of the things that we've talked about, before with the issue with frequency, specifically with biblical Hebrew, is just the lack of data. When people do frequency studies in English, they use corpora of 50 million words, right? And it's just a totally different ballgame to use a corpus like a biblical Hebrew. We have like 1 million words, I think less than 1 million. And so it's just, you just don't have enough. So just to wrap up, just a couple of questions practically. And we've touched on, probably way too many things. But I wanted to give this sort of high level overview, just to even give people a taste of like what's out there, like what kinds of things, do we see in the world's languages? What kinds of things do we need to consider when we're approaching a language? So just, you have done this, right? So you went to Malaysia and studied a language you didn't know, right? And, documented it and try to figure out the grammar, right? Of that language. So as someone who's done it, how do you practically go about trying to determine a language's basic order?
Yeah. All right. Here, I would say the place to start, if basic means pragmatically neutral, I think that's a good thing to aim for. One standard way to start is to look for an out of the blue type of statement, something. What the discourse functions have to do with is what's the current state of shared knowledge between the speaker and the hearer. And that's going to determine which part is new, which part's old, what are we talking about, what's the focus of my current statement. But if I rush up to you and tell you something just out of the blue, or if you ask a question, what just happened? What happened? I'm telling you something, in a sense, without background information, right? That answer to the question, what happened, is often to some way of thinking. I mean, think my way of thinking is that might be a good place to start, because no individual element of the clause has special status. It's all new information. So that's one way to get at a basic word order. Actually, for living languages, if you have dictionary examples, the example sentences in a dictionary have to stand alone. They have to create their own context, and often those turn out to be useful. But again, as I said, conversational usage would be what we're after. In the text that we have from ancient languages, if we can look at conversational bits, right, that'll give us a sense. One reason conversation is important is because it's very difficult in looking at a monologue text. Again, we just have the text. We don't have native speakers. We don't have information about intonation patterns. But looking at a text is very hard to be sure of for any given sentence. What is the topic? What is the focus? Different people have different theories about Greek word order or Hebrew word order. We'll look at the same verse and they'll identify, well, this is the topic and that's the focus. And someone else will say, no, in the same verse, that's the focus, that's the topic. The theory tells them which way it should be. But really, it's a notorious problem for people to try to do this on text. They just recognize identifying topic and focus in a monologue text is really tough. And so we can't assume that we can do that reliably. Even with spoken languages, there's lots of interesting issues. If you mentioned when I was doing my fieldwork in East Malaysia, it turns out the languages there are similar to languages of the Central Philippines, and those are some languages where it's not at all clear that the grammatical subject is a default topic. There's a separation between topic and subject. And helping a guy translate the story of Ananias and Sapphira, where they sell a piece of land, give some of the money, and keep some of the money. And Peter says to Ananias, "Is this all the money?" And Ananias said, "Yes." He falls down dead. The young men came in and wrapped up the body and carried him out. So the guy I'm working with is doing a pretty good job. It's translating something that was an Indonesian Bible storybook from the United Bible Society. And when he gets to the verse about Ananias fell down dead and the young men came in, wrapped up the body, carried him out and buried him, it really was not natural in the language anymore. It was more like word for word gloss of the Indonesian. And so I said, well, here, let me try to rearrange this and make it seem like more natural word order. So having studied the language for about 2 months, it's not like I can do the language all that well, but I took the words and rearranged the words to make it look more natural according to what I thought. And the guy looked at it and said, okay, yeah, that sounds better. Of course, if we say that, we're going to think that Ananias fell down dead and then he got up and wrapped up his own body and carried himself out and buried himself. So I got confused between the topic, which was, I was expecting zero reference to subject to be interpreted, the prodrop of subject to be interpreted as continuing same subject, but in fact it was continuing topic who turned out not to be the subject, but assuming he had to be the agent for all these things going on. All right, so that's a long-winded example, but it's hard to predict what the pitfalls are going to be. There's plenty of them.
Yeah, no, that is a really interesting example, and I think just we'll wrap up with this. But to your point earlier of the topic and focus, and it is part of the problem is that depending on how you define, especially topic, almost anything could be a topic sometimes, and so then what happens is whatever you see a fronted constituent, right? It's topic because I can, if my definition of topic allows for something very, very broad, right? Then I can always just throw the topic label at it. Which, and these are tricky issues, right? But it goes to show that we really, if you're going to do word order, we really do need to have, pretty precise definitions on what topic is, right? What focus is. So we can identify these things or not identify them. And like you say, at the end of the day, we have to be very careful in any second language, right? But especially second languages where we have very limited data, very limited knowledge of, and that's the case with both Greek and Hebrew, any ancient language. It's not to say that we're doomed, but we just have to be, I think, more careful than we have been. So anything else you have for us as we wrap up?
Well, topic and focus are such big. I'd love to spend some time talking about that, but I'm sure you'll do that in some future show. Let me not even get into it because there's just too much to be said there.
Well, I think a good place to start would be going to your textbook, right? Analyzing Meaning, which you can get for free.
Yes.
So you can download that, and that's where I first learned topic and focus and these terms. So
technically, I don't have a chapter on topic and focus in that textbook. I do have a chapter in analyzing syntax.
You don't have something on information?
I have a very short introductory piece that's available on my website. It was published as a working papers.
Okay.
Just a brief introduction. So I could send you the link to that if you want.
Yeah.
But no, in the textbook, that was one of the things we had to leave out just because there were too many other things to cover in the semantics textbook.
Well, maybe it was in a draft that I had read. Or maybe I'm just forgetting. I don't know.
Maybe, but I think you did take the syntax course as well. You would have seen it in the syntax course.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, great. So this was a lot of fun, and so that's all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast. And thank you, Paul, for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin. It's been fun.
And thank you to all of our listeners out there who have taken the time to listen to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.